Hi everybody, thank you for joining. My name is Ella and today I will be sharing a bit about my research dissertation titled Healing Early Wounds, exploring the effectiveness of trauma-focused CBT for children and young people who have experienced interpersonal trauma. So just a little bit about me. I'm currently in my final year of the series of counselling at Bangor. Before this, I completed a undergraduate degree in childhood and youth studies, and this is where I first developed a strong interest in adverse childhood experiences and how these early challenges can affect individuals throughout their lives. This interest was further deepened during my time at a local youth homelessness project, where I saw the lasting impact of trauma and instability can have on young people's lives. And it was these experiences that led me to the MSc in Counselling at Bangor, as I wanted to develop a better understanding of mental health and learn new skills to better equip me to work in this area in the future. So I'll start by giving a quick overview of the presentation. I'll start out with some background literature on this topic, and then I'll move on to my methodology, my results and my discussion, and then there'll be time for some future considerations and questions at the end. Childhood trauma is a widespread societal issue, with recent statistics revealing that 1 in 4 children experience at least one traumatic event before the age of 18. These events are commonly referred to as adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, a term that was first introduced in the CDC Kaiser study by Felitti et al. In 1998, which explored the long-term effects of childhood adversity on adult health and well-being. The original ACE framework identified 10 categories of adversity, falling into 3 main types. The first one is abuse, focusing on emotional, physical, and sexual. The second is neglect, focusing on emotional and physical. And then the last is household dysfunction, which focuses on parental mental illness, substance misuse, incarceration, separation, divorce, and domestic violence. What is the impact? The effect of adverse childhood experiences is well documented across a wide body of research. Adverse childhood experiences not only affect the child's immediate well-being, but also their long-term development and ability to manage future stresses. These experiences, particularly when ongoing or multiple, disrupt key biological systems, including the stress response, emotion regulation, and executive functioning. As a result, children who have experienced ACEs often face difficulties with learning, attention, memory, and impulse control. They may struggle to form secure relationships or regulate their emotions in healthy ways. These developmental impacts can affect their performance at school, their ability to trust others, and their overall sense of safety within the world. The psychological effects are significant. Adverse childhood experiences are strongly associated with increased rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. These issues often begin in childhood and adolescence, but also can persist into adulthood if left unaddressed. Behaviourally, many children exposed to ACEs adopt maladaptive coping strategies to deal with the overwhelming emotions. These can be things like substance misuse, self-harm, aggression, or early sexual activity. These behaviours often emerge as ways of managing distress in the absence of safe, supportive coping tools. In later adulthood, the long-term consequences can be severe. ACEs are linked to a range of chronic health problems, including heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and gastro disorders. They're also associated with early mortality, increased contact with criminal justice systems, and higher rates of homelessness. Crucially, this is what is known as a dose-response effect, meaning that the more ACEs a child is exposed to, the greater their risk is for negative outcomes across nearly every domain of functioning, for example, physical, emotional, behavioural, and social. Understanding the wide-ranging impacts is essential, not only for responding to children in distress, but also for shaping early interventions that can interrupt these patterns before they become deeply embedded. Trauma-focused CBT is a widely supported, evidence-based intervention for children and young people who experience trauma, particularly interpersonal ACEs such as abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Research consistently highlights its effectiveness in reducing symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and behavioral difficulties. Trauma-focused CBT integrates cognitive behavioral techniques with trauma-informed strategies to help children process traumatic experiences, develop emotional regulation skills, and build healthier coping mechanisms. It is typically delivered over 12 to 20 sessions with parents or caregivers involved in this to support the child's progress and reinforce learning at home. Treatment is structured across three different phases: stabilization, trauma narration and processing, and integration. These phases incorporate the core components of the practice model, which includes psychoeducation, relaxation techniques, affect regulation, cognitive coping, and gradual exposure to trauma-related memories. In the final phase, therapy focuses on applying these skills, planning for safety, and preparing for the end of treatment. A key aim of trauma-focused CBT is not only to reduce symptoms, but also to reshape trauma-related beliefs, decrease avoidance, and rebuild trust and safety within relationships. Evidence of its effectiveness continues to grow. For instance, a study conducted by Felix et al. 2013 found that trauma-focused CBT significantly reduced post-traumatic stress symptoms, with improvements sustained up to 12 months after treatment. A further study reported similar findings in a large-scale meta-analysis, showing that trauma-focused CBT's superiority over waitlist and treatment as usual conditions. Strong evidence supporting the effectiveness of trauma-focused CBT. Much of the existing literature focuses narrowly on symptom reduction, without examining the wider factors that influence whether treatment succeeds or not. Few studies explored the relational, emotional, and contextual factors, such as caregiver involvement, readiness for trauma processing, or other systematic barriers. Therefore, this review aims to address this gap in literature by exploring the predictors that contribute to positive outcomes, as well as the barriers that might hinder engagement, accessibility, and completion. This systematic review also used the SPIDER framework to help guide the inclusion criteria. For the sample, I included studies that involved children and young people under the age of 18 years old. I also included studies that involved caregivers or parents, where their roles were connected to the child's outcomes. And then lastly, I also included therapists with their experiences of delivering trauma-focused CBT to help give an insight into the factors that affect in a good way or in a negative way. The phenomenon of interest, so I focused on trauma-focused CBT being delivered to children and young people who have experienced interpersonal trauma, specifically within the framework of the original 10 ACEs that were identified in the Kaiser study, and these include abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. I chose to narrow the scope to adversity within the home rather than include all types of trauma, and this decision wasn't to minimise other forms of trauma such as accidents or community violence or bullying, but to allow more of a focused understanding of how trauma-focused CBT works in the context of ongoing relational adversity. And again, the design, I included a mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative studies, so randomised control trials, things like that. And then the evaluation. So studies were required to report on child outcomes such as symptom reduction in PTSD, anxiety, behaviour changes, things like that. And I also included studies that explored the barriers of implementation, so caregiver engagement and therapist factors that might influence effectiveness. And then lastly, research type. Only peer-reviewed empirical studies were included, and they all had to be published in English between 2015 and 2025. There was no restrictions on location, gender, or ethnicity, as long as they focused on trauma-focused CBT for children affected by interpersonal traumas. Next, I used the inclusion criteria to develop a set of key search terms to then go ahead and search across 4 different databases. These included PubMed, Web of Science, and Science Direct. And then I did one final search through Bangor Library just for a comprehensive result. Across all of the 4 databases, I found 1,079 papers, and then I exported them into EndNote, which is a literature organizing software. I then removed 120 duplicates and screened 959 by title and abstract. I removed 673 papers due to not meeting the eligibility criteria, which left me with 286 papers for full text screening. After screening all of the papers, 243 papers were removed for several reasons. So things like being out of the ACEs scope, so non-interpersonal trauma related, wrong population, so mostly they were parents, and insufficient data or did not report treatment outcomes of trauma-focused CBT. So in total, 43 papers met full eligibility and were included in the final review. There were a total of 43 studies that took part in this systematic review, all of which were spanned across a wide range of countries and contexts. Most were conducted in the United States or Canada, Norway, Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, and more. Sample sizes varied from small pilot studies of 20 participants to larger scale trials involving over 1,800 children. While the full age range spanned from 3 to 18 years old, most studies focused on children aged 10 to 15. The samples were predominantly female, typically 60% to 85%, with some studies reporting even higher proportions. However, specific subgroups like male offenders were also represented. Trauma-focused CBT was also implemented across an equally wide range of settings, from outpatient clinics to home-based services, community programs, residential care, and juvenile offending facilities. Trauma-focused CBT consistently produced strong outcomes across a wide range of trauma-related symptoms. Most notably, PTSD symptoms were significantly reduced across multiple studies. For example, Eberhardt et al.'s 2018 study reported a decrease in PTSD scores from 44.9 to 15.8, while another study reported that 79% of participants showed clinically significant improvements following treatment. In addition to PTSD, children and adolescents experienced improvements in depression, anxiety, and emotional regulation. Studies also reported meaningful reductions in behavioral problems such as aggression and defiance. These therapeutic gains were not only evident at the end of treatment, but were also sustained over time. Follow-up assessments found that improvements were maintained up to 6 to 12 months after therapy concluded. Were there any differences across ages, gender, ethnicity, and settings? Most studies focus on older children and adolescents, with younger children significantly underrepresented. A few studies used play or art-based adaptations for younger participants, but these were limited. Outcomes for children in care were mixed. It was found that youth with consistent, engaged caregivers responded well, but care leavers and those in unstable placements experienced higher dropout, often due to disrupted caregiving and systematic barriers. Older teens also showed higher rates of disengagement, particularly during the trauma processing phase. In terms of gender, while girls were more likely to access trauma-focused CBT than males, some studies show that they had lower treatment responses, whereas studies with predominantly male samples typically involved incarcerated or justice-involved youth, highlighting a gap in community-based research with males. Finally, ethnic minorities and low-income youths often benefited when engaged, but faced greater systematic and contextual barriers to both access and retention. Several key factors shaped the success or failure of trauma-focused CBT in this review. One of the most important were whether children were supported to engage and complete the full practice model, particularly during the trauma narration phase, which is where the most strain was found. However, dropout rates varied widely, from 13% up to 78% in some studies, which were especially due to children and families lacking emotional readiness or support. In addition to this, caregiver involvement played a critical role. When caregivers were emotionally engaged, outcomes improved. But when they avoided the trauma or became overwhelmed, children were most likely to disengage. Therapists themselves often avoided trauma-focused components, often out of fear that children weren't ready, particularly in high-risk cases. Across multiple studies, a strong therapeutic alliance built on trust was a key to keeping children engaged and safe during emotional difficult stages. And ultimately, child's readiness, their emotional capacity to engage with the trauma, was a major predictor of success. Then that brings me to the discussion part of my presentation. The results from this review reaffirms that trauma-focused CBT is a highly effective intervention for children and young people exposed to interpersonal traumas, with consistent reduction seen in PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other trauma-related symptoms. A key strength of trauma-focused CBT is that it's a phase-based approach, which supports engagement and recovery by gradually moving children through stabilization, trauma processing, and integration. Completion of all phases was a key predictor of effectiveness. This can be seen in Peter et al.'s 2021 study, where 16 out of 20 participants met diagnostic criteria for PTSD at baseline, compared to just one after completing the full model. This highlights that the full potential in recovery where treatment is delivered as intended. However, delivering all phases, especially the trauma processing stage, was often a challenge. The review shown that many therapists avoided or adapted trauma-specific components, often due to fears about overwhelming the child or a lack of confidence in their own ability to manage the distress. Interestingly, several studies found that therapists rated their competence lowest for trauma components and were more likely to opt for more flexible, non-directive approaches instead, like psychoeducation. These fidelity issues, while rooted in caution, risk disrupting key mechanisms of change. Without the trauma processing stage, recovery may be limited or short-lived. This highlights the need for targeted therapist training and more clinical supervision to ensure that therapists can confidently and safely deliver all phases as intended, including its most challenging elements if it's well supported. At the same time, the studies in this review revealed that dropout rates and disengagement were common challenges to treatment, particularly around the trauma processing stage. These were rarely down to just practical issues. A lot of the children, especially those with complex traumas, dropped out due to avoidance, mistrust, or emotional overwhelm. Some disengaged before trauma work even began. In some cases, a temporary spike in symptoms, such as the trauma narration stage, was followed by a major clinical gain, suggesting that distress during the processing may be necessary for long-term change. Consistent finding in my review was that the protective role of caregivers could mitigate these challenges. Children whose caregivers attended sessions, modeled emotional regulation, and engaged in trauma work were more likely to complete treatment and improve. However, caregiver support was often inconsistent. Barriers included caregivers' own personal trauma and mental health needs, as well as other logistical challenges. In some high-risk groups, like children in care, a stable caregiver was not always available, and this meant that therapists often omitted this stage of therapy altogether. These findings show that caregiver engagement is not just helpful, it's essential. Without it, dropout was more likely and treatment fidelity was compromised. Increasing caregiver readiness and offering flexible, trauma-informed support would help strengthen this part of the model. This systematic review aimed to explore the factors that predict the effectiveness of trauma-focused CBT, as well as the challenges that can limit its impacts for children and young people. While the evidence strongly supports trauma-focused CBT's ability to reduce trauma-related symptoms, the findings emphasize that success depends on more than just the intervention itself. Completion of the full model, particularly the trauma processing stage, emerged as a central predictor of outcomes, supported by therapist confidence, caregiver involvement, and the child's emotional readiness. Yet, these same elements were often undermined by fidelity issues, emotional avoidance, and contextual barriers, especially in high risk settings. Overall, the review highlights the need for ongoing support, supervision, and flexibility in delivery, ensuring that trauma focused CBT can be implemented effectively and equally across diverse and real world contexts.